Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining this track. Please welcome Alex Dutra and Mark Paluch as they present Staying Ahead of the Curve with Spring and Cassandra 4.
Thank you. Hello, folks. Thank you so much for attending Spring One. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far, and thank you for being here today for this presentation. So my name is Alex Dutra, and I'm here today with my friend Mark from VMware to talk about what's new in the Spring and Cassandra ecosystem. And let me share my screen with you guys right now. There you go. Okay, so we're going to cover 4 topics today, and we're going to start from the bottom, the database itself, and we're going to go up to the application layers and see what's new about the driver, Spring Data Cassandra, and Spring Boot. So let's get started right away and see what's new in the Cassandra database and why you should start using Datasets Astra now. Actually, we have big news to announce. Cassandra 4.0 is approaching GA, and this release is going to be the most stable Apache Cassandra version in history. It has thousands of bug fixes, improvements, new features. It's being battle tested right now, so it should be production ready from day one. It's being tested on clusters as large as 1,000 nodes, and it's being tested with hundreds of real-world use cases. Here's a glimpse of all the good stuff coming in Cassandra 4. We are going to have zero-copy streaming, which makes data streaming between nodes up to 5 times faster. We're going to have audit logging, which brings enterprise-grade security and also compliance with regulations to Cassandra. Improved incremental repair. Virtual tables, they behave like normal tables, but they can expose any kind of information, such as system metrics, for example. We are going to have support for Java 11 and ZGC, and also configurable ports per node, which makes it easier to containerize Cassandra clusters. So this slide has a lot of links that you folks cannot see right now, but they will hopefully be accessible offline, all right? The best thing to do is to simply try it out. So a first beta version was released back in July, and beta 2 has just been released yesterday, actually. So you can either download it or just use Docker. And the next big news is in the Cassandra space is Datasets Astra. So Astra is DataStax's Cassandra as a service offering. And with Astra, you can choose to deploy Cassandra clusters to AWS or GCP, so there is no risk of vendor locking, right? It offers enterprise-level reliability, security, automatic scalability, all of this for your data. It also makes application development much easier with the new REST and GraphQL APIs to query Cassandra. And finally, data modeling is also very easy now with DataStax Studio, which is our notebook-like tool to visualize and manipulate data. So again, the simplest thing to do is to try it out. All registered users get a free 10 gigabyte space. We also have this nice little example here of how to connect to Astra using Spring Boot and Spring Data Cassandra. Simply fork it or try it on GitHub if you prefer. All right, so my second topic for you today is about what's new in the Cassandra Java driver. And again, we have lots of good news. The current release is 4.9, released yesterday. And the 4.x series is a major evolution from driver 3. So the driver internals went fully asynchronous and non-blocking. You now have execution profiles, and Mark is going to give an example of that later. You also have global timeouts. That is, if you say my timeout is 5 seconds, then it will be 5 seconds in total, including retries. So it makes it much easier for you to reason about SLAs. We have an improved load balancing policy with a new algorithm that is very efficient at selecting the fastest nodes in the cluster. However, it comes with a caveat. Now the driver requires from you to specify the local data center because the driver now enforces local connectivity to that data center only. And you're going to see one example of that later as well. Improved metrics. We now have the ability to distinguish session level from node level metrics. We also have the ability to plug in your own metric framework. The driver comes with Drop Wizard by default, but Micrometer and Microprofile are both supported as well. And we have improved object mapping framework. No more reflection anywhere. Everything is done at compile time with annotation processor, which is so much faster and so much more efficient. Okay, if you need to upgrade existing applications from driver 3 to driver 4, the first thing to change are the Maven coordinates. You're also going to need to change package names, and for that, you could do a simple global search and replace, in my opinion. But we do acknowledge that it's not always easy to migrate from 3 to 4, and because of that, you will likely have to adapt your code a little bit. If you're having trouble migrating to driver 4, we're here to help. You can follow the upgrade guide. You can ask questions at community.datastax.com or Stack Overflow if you prefer. And there's also the driver mailing list. But today I'm going to show a few examples of how to upgrade from driver 3 to driver 4. So the first noticeable change is that there is no more cluster object. It has been merged with the session object into a single interface called SQL session. SQL session is now your single entry point to the driver. We also got rid of Guava. One of the nice consequences of that is that all the Guava features were replaced with standard Java 8 features, which makes, in my opinion, asynchronous code much more expressive now. Another thing to think about is that almost all driver built-in implementations right now are immutable and thread safe. This is great, of course, but there's one caveat, right? Every mutator method now returns a different object, which means that you must capture the returned object, otherwise the mutation is lost. So this is probably the trickiest change in driver 4 because your legacy code would still compile just fine, but it would be semantically broken, right? So what do we do? One way to improve your code is to use builders. Builders remain mutable even in driver 4. But there's more. There's something else you can do. You can actually configure your IDE to detect a special annotation called check return value. We annotated our API extensively with this annotation to warn you when you shouldn't discard the returned value. And if you do, your IDE can now warn you. And this here is an example of what IntelliJ tells me if I forget to reassign the value in the previous example. See? Another very nice change is the new async result set interface. If you recall driver 3, and if you did asynchronous code with driver 3, you know that the API was very cumbersome and error prone, right? Some methods could accidentally trigger a blocking call, and this is really bad. So the new API is hopefully much cleaner, and such spurious blocking calls right now can simply not happen anymore. So that's great. Driver 4 has also a brand new reactive API, so let me have a few words about it now. So we have a new execute reactive method that returns a reactive result set. And this guy is just a reactive streams compliant publisher. So because of that, you can wrap that publisher into your favorite reactive library and start querying Cassandra in reactive style. Although there's one thing to note, which is that when you call execute reactive and when the call returns, the query has not been executed yet. But this is by design because the query only executes when a subscriber arrives and subscribes to the reactive result set object. Okay, something to keep in mind. And as I said, we also have support for Cassandra 4. So about multiple ports per node, actually, this is the main reason why now you need to provide contact points with their individual port numbers. And we're going to see some examples later. And as for virtual tables, as I said before, they can be queried just like normal tables. So from the driver perspective, there isn't anything special about them. However, if you're inspecting the table metadata, you can tell a virtual table from a normal table by simply inspecting this new isVirtual method. All right, with that, I will hand over to my friend Mark, and he will walk us through Spring Data Cassandra and Spring Boot. Enjoy.
Thank you, Alex. So
just stop sharing right now. You should be good to go.
Thanks. Great. So let me walk you through what's new in Spring Data Cassandra 3.0 and Spring Boot 2.4, 2.3, sorry. I know version numbers can be quite compelling to understand, so we have also a slide built in for you that explains which driver versions and which database versions and Spring Boot versions you can use together. The big and most significant change in Spring Data Cassandra 3.0 is that we have upgraded to the new driver, which comes with a lot of internal changes. So this release ships mostly with the upgrade story and not so much on the feature side. However, you will be able, by upgrading to Spring Data Cassandra 3.0, to leverage embedded objects. We will have a look on that later on. You can use the add value annotation in constructors of your entities. And this is used when materializing objects. And you will be able to plug in a custom naming strategy. And this tells how table names, entity names translate to table names, properties to columns, and so on and so forth. Now, if you upgrade to Spring Data Cassandra 3.0, then you will have to upgrade as well to the new Cassandra driver. And this is because the Cassandra driver is entirely different from its previous version, and there was no chance to retain a level of compatibility between those two drivers. And with that, you will have also to adopt your own code in terms of configuration, entity model, and these kind of things. Your mileage on how much effort you will have to spend will vary. And it varies by the level of abstraction that you are using. If you are using purely the repository layer with a few mapped entities, then probably you won't have to spend as much effort to upgrade in comparison to if you use SQL operations, asynchronous SQL operations, or if you go down to the statement level of the driver. The lower you go, the more effort you will likely have with migrating. We have prepared a migration guide for you, which is shipped with the reference documentation. Once you get hold of the slides, you will be able to follow that link. And for the impatient, just navigate to the reference documentation of Spring Data Cassandra. And as mentioned, most of the changes are internal ones to make the upgrade path for you as smooth as possible. You can prepare, if you haven't upgraded yet, by mostly migrating away from the things that will be supported in the new version out of the box. One of these examples is the use of the date type, which is reflected by the local date type shipped by the driver. You can easily switch now to the JSR 310 local date type, and later on you won't have to touch that bits. But however, the driver has changed some internals. So if you are using things like schema generation or type hinting with the @Cassandra type annotation, then likely you will have to spend a bit of time there, since the enumeration, type enumeration in the driver was removed, and we had to recreate that one within Spring Data Cassandra. There are also a few other changes, like case sensitivity. The driver is able to determine itself whether case sensitivity is required or not. So we deprecated the force quote annotation in favor of the driver internal functionality. You will also have to review and adapt your configuration. The recommended way how to configure your application is through Spring Boot, because that's the most convenient and most simple way. However, if you don't use Spring Boot, or you are using an own configuration object, or even if you are using still XML to configure your application, you can stick with these facilities. If you're using XML, you will see several changes in the namespace support, since cluster and session concepts were merged into a single session object now. So you will have likely to spend a bit more time on that area. Now, let's take a look onto execution profiles. So execution profiles are basically an aid to specify common settings for a per statement execution model. So you can specify timeouts, consistency level, retry policies, these kind of things. in your driver configuration, and then simply refer to that execution profile from your application. You don't need to specify all the settings within your own code, like it was with the driver 3, but rather define that in a single place, all those settings, and then refer to that execution profile. You can do that on various levels. You can use the query builder statement API to set the execution profile name. You can associate a CQL template object with an execution profile, and all queries that are being executed with that profile, with that template, gets associated with that profile. Or if you use the entity-based approach, then you can leverage insert options, update options, and all the other options classes to associate that execution profile with the desired statement and activity that you want to invoke. Final thing in the Spring Data part is the embedded object support. So embedded objects are to improve your domain model. You know, Cassandra tables are flat, except for user-defined types. But you don't want always to use user-defined types when you want to model your data with a proper domain model. Sometimes you want to have nested types, and that's exactly what embedded objects do. They come with a data structure that you can use within your own code, and the data structure is basically a POJO. All the fields are getting flattened out during the write to the database and made into an object graph when reading and materializing an object from a result. Optionally, you can specify a prefix if you intend to use an embedded object multiple times, like here in this customer object. We have a billing address and a shipping address, and all the billing fields are prefixed with billing underscore, and the same goes for the shipping address. You can specify whether the object should be null or empty if the fields are empty, and the reference documentation will guide you through the remaining bits of how embedded objects work. Now let's take a look on Spring Boot 2.3. So Spring Boot 2.3 ships as well with the Cassandra Driver 4 upgrade, and you will have to stick to the Cassandra Driver 4. There's no way, again, how to use the previous driver in Spring Boot 2.3, except for the bit if you disable all auto configuration. But with doing so, you lose immediately all the configuration properties support that is baked into Spring Boot. You have, if you want to configure your driver, then you have to use your application properties or application YAML in order to specify all the properties. Alternatively, if you need more control, then there are some programmatic facilities. And I will walk you through these now. So a few configuration properties have changed in the Spring Boot support. For instance, the port was deprecated in favor of specifying the port with every single contact point. So you are able to specify now the port within the contact point, and you simply delimit multiple contact points with a comma. The second thing that has also changed is that you have to specify the local data center name, and that wasn't the case with the earlier version. So now if you start your Spring Boot application without that property, you will run into an error that will tell you, please specify the local data center. There are also a few more changes to the configuration, and this slide summarizes all the most significant changes that have happened. Again, that's something for you to consume after the presentation when you get hold of the slides. Now, if you want to customize the Cassandra session, then we urge you to stick as much as possible to Spring Boot's auto configuration, unless you ultimately have to define your own CQL session bean. And the reason for that is that Spring Boot populates all the application properties for you, so you have only to specify the application properties. Spring Boot is going to pick that up. And in addition to that, you can hook into the process of building the session and configuring the session. And there are two hook points. One is a session builder customizer to customize options on the session builder itself. And there's a much more low-level facility, the driver config, and you can customize the driver config loader builder with the driver config loader builder customizer. You know, Spring is 4 long class names, but for a good reason. And if you want to go really low level, then driver config loader builder customizer is the right thing for you. You declare those as plain beans, either in Lambda form or as fully fledged class. And then you can apply customizations to the CQL session, to the driver config as you need. And there's one more thing to note, because in some places you even are required to use the driver config loader builder customizer, because currently there's no other way how to specify a profile and how to define those properties. I think we will reconsider that arrangement and to do something about that in the future Spring Boot versions. But for now, that's the only way how to get to profile, since currently you also cannot attach the driver own configuration file mechanism, which would otherwise be in place for those profiles. Now, you can connect with Datasets Astra, and you don't. The good news here is you can leverage also a lot of Spring Boot functionality. You don't need to specify the local data center, but you need to specify the location to the secure connect bundle. It's essentially a zip file shipping with certificates, endpoint descriptors, so connection details. So what we would do is specify the path in your application properties, inject that path, spin up a SQL session builder customizer, and attach the connect bundle, and then you can connect directly to Datasets Astra from Spring Boot. Now, this is, as mentioned earlier, the compatibility metrics slide, which tells you which driver and which Spring Data Cassandra and which Spring Boot version you can use. And as you see, if you want to use Cassandra driver 4, you have to use Spring Data Cassandra 3.0 or newer, and Spring Boot 2.3 and newer. If you want to stick with the Cassandra driver 3, then you will have to stay on the 2.2 line of both components. And all that being said, let's wrap up here. I was really grateful to present at Spring One. We are going to see each other hopefully in the Q&A session after the talk now. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mark and Alex. That was great. If you have any follow-up questions, there's a Q&A starting right now. Just click on the link on the breakout session page and ask all the questions you want. Otherwise, we'll be starting the next session in about 5 minutes, so stretch your legs, refresh your drink, and we'll see you then.